morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tania Hope. I'm the director of the Ralph Bunche International Affairs Center at Howard University. Can you all hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us for this next edition of our annual lecture series, Shaping Our Future Through Sustainable Development Goals. We are very excited that you took time out of your schedule to join us for yet another Zoom event, but we will definitely aim to make it worth your while, and I'm sure that with the guests that we have today, it will be. So I am going to pass the microphone to my colleague Crystal Yule. First of all, though, I would like to thank our guests, Ms. Oona Nelson, senior from Howard University, president of the Howard University chapter of the United Nations Association, Professor Mietek Boduszynski, who is a professor at Pomona College, but comes to us through a new relationship that we've established with the Middle East Institute, where he is a fellow. Our very own Dr. Dawuni from the Political Science Department at Howard University, and Alexandra Montgomery from Amnesty International Brazil. So we were really trying to cover the world. I think we've done a really good job with that. So I'm really excited to hear what our guests have to say. And now I'll pass you to Crystal. Thank you.
Thank you, Tania. Good morning, everyone. My name is Crystal Yule, and I am the program coordinator of the Patricia Roberts Harris Public Affairs Fellowship in the Ralph Bunche International Affairs Center. So today I want to explain a little bit why we're talking about law and order in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals of peace, justice, and strong institutions. Today, as emboldened collectives emerge and mobilize for justice across the world, we see that citizens' demand for peace, justice, and strong institutions are often coupled with the opposing rhetoric of law and order. Historically, during times of civil unrest, the rhetoric of law and order has emerged time and again in such a way to distract from the root of the unrest, which tends to be the lack of investment in social services, which often leads to weakened institutions, the increased investment in policing and military at the cost of peace, and racial inequality and lack of civic engagement in the political process, which is linked to injustice. In the United States context, for example, Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, explained the beginnings and the implications of the rhetoric of law and order. She stated, the rhetoric of law and order was first mobilized in the late 1950s as Southern governors and law enforcement officials attempted to generate and mobilize white opposition to the civil rights movement. In the years following Brown versus Board of Education, civil rights activists used direct action tactics in an effort to force reluctant Southern states to desegregate public facilities. Southern governors and law enforcement officials often characterize these tactics as criminal and argue that the rise of the civil rights movement was indicative of a breakdown of law and order. Support of civil rights legislation was derided by Southern conservatives as merely rewarding lawbreakers. For more than a decade, she argued, from the mid-1950s until the late 1960s, conservatives systematically and strategically linked opposition to civil rights legislation to calls for law and order. They argued that Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of civil disobedience was a leading cause of crime. Today, we see a similar issue. In the United States, against the backdrop of purposefully weakened democratic institutions, rampant police brutality, and a contentious election, President Trump has declared himself the president of law and order and even tweeted the phrase law and order, vote, to his millions of followers. Similarly, in Brazil, President Bolsonaro expanded protections to police and military who kill in the name of law and order. In Nigeria, outcry against the exploitative and deadly practices of SARS, the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, has caused President Buhari of Nigeria to say he's willing to use military force to crack down on the protests, again in the name of law and order. As we consider the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of peace, justice, and strong institutions, it's imperative that we consider the consequences of this rhetoric. Today's presenters will do exactly that and think more deeply about some of the questions. How does the rhetoric of law and order manifest in their particular regions? What is the impact of peace, justice, and strong institutions on the struggle for peace, justice, and strong institutions? And how does that rhetoric also change around election periods? Now, I'd like to turn it over to Oona Nelson as she talks a little bit more about that sustainable development goal and why it's important. Oona?
Thank you so much, Crystal. I'm super excited to be part of this panel today and to kind of be the transition before we get into the experts within the regions. So hello, everybody. My name is Oona Nelson. Again, I'm a senior international business major, and I have a double concentration in emerging nations and sub-Saharan Africa, then a double minor in political science and economics. So even though I am a student, I may know a thing or two about peace, justice, and strong institutions is something that I've been really intrigued to study in my coursework. And actually one of my professors is on the panel right now, so I hope I impress her. Let's see if this reading will stick to me today. And so I kind of want to start off by talking about what the Sustainable Development Goals are. So the UN cultivated these 17, we call them SDG goals for short. Essentially, they are initiatives that we're trying to push for the world to become a more just, peaceful, and more equitable world, right? And so they were cultivated in 2015, and we gave them a deadline until 2030. So it's at 2020 right now. We have 10 more years, right, to really make the strides to reach all the SDGs, right? And so number 16 is the Sustainable Development Goal of peace, justice, and strong institutions. But what does that mean? Crystal gave a really, really great opening remarks about what the world is coming to today. What does that look like? How does that change during election periods? And so on the United Nations Development Program, we have some facts and figures kind of going into what that means and what that means for different countries, because peace and justice means different for different countries, different democracies, and different government and political structures, right? So what do we have here? We have people around the world who have stateless people who don't have aligned nationality and related rights. So if you look at the certain parts of the world, you have people living in countries that aren't recognized as citizens. That means they don't have government benefits such as healthcare, protection, income, insurance, etc. So another element of peace, justice, and strong institutions is taking care of the people, right? Having governance. But there are some people who are not recognized, right? This also looks like corruption and bribery, tax evasion, that kind of plagues a lot of developing countries right now. And that's an issue. We have people working in government that we trust, right? And they are misusing the system, people can't trust, and that leads to more civil unrest, more than before. We have countries that lack laws for protecting women against domestic violence. That means if I can go to a country today, right, and not have equal protection because I'm a woman, if I want to try a case in the court's legal system, that I don't have any odds of winning because I don't have laws protecting me as a woman, as an individual. We also have instances of equality amongst governance. What does that look like? Right now in the United States alone, one of the most developed countries in the world, our government is not equal. 2016 alone, we had the most women and diversity in our Congress, more than we have in the whole US history. There's some countries that have women state leaders, and there's some countries that haven't. The US is the only developed country right now that hasn't had a woman in leadership ever. So that's something to look towards as well. And there are also people in the world who can't claim identity. They can't claim who they are. They have no birth certificates, passports. They're roamlessly aiming around in their country because they don't have the governance to protect people or to identify them as people. That means they have no rights, no access to food, insurance, healthcare, etc. So these are the issues we're kind of looking at towards peace, justice, and strong institutions. Essentially, how do you take care of your people? How does your government take care of you? And throughout different parts of the world, we can kind of see how this element of governance manifests, right? We can see with the rise of globalization, we're reducing borders right now. We're more exposed to how governments can affect things like international trade, business, the stock market, etc. I think COVID-19 really exposed a lot of the inequalities we are now experiencing in the world in terms of governments, whether that be healthcare, justice and equality, depending on how the COVID-19 virus is affecting certain populations. It's exposing populations that are marginalized. We have people dying in loads of amounts, but we have people of different ethnicities taking on the toll a lot more greatly. And these are the issues we want to focus on, not only in the US, but we have countries that look at, or overall, overarchingly, have different themes of governance. You know, the US is based on a democracy, right? But we have countries that focus their political systems on monarchies. We have just different elements of that here. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what type of political structure we aim to choose for our government, but it's about taking care of our people. And I'm super excited to listen in on the panelists today to see how the different regions look at political structures, how they manifest it, and ultimately how they take care of their people. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Oona, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, the Bunche Center, Ms. Hope, Ms. Krista, Yuli, for having me here today. I am looking forward to this engagement. So I think for the sake of time, and also for the fact that I think we've got great introductions done already by Krista and Oona, I'm going to keep mine as short as possible and hopefully leave time for questions. The charge today is to look at the SDG number 16. And as Crystal said, it started off with 2015. Now, the precursor to the SDGs was the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which the end point was 2015. And of course, we got there and realized that there was still a lot that needed to be done. So the SDGs have come, we are halfway through it, and we hope that we can have some achievements that would be worth looking back to. But as we know, with the COVID-19 situation and global events happening, political instability happening everywhere, we're waiting and hoping that it doesn't explode in this country next week. But with all the political instability happening, the increase in ethno-nationalism, the increase in environmental distraction, we can only hope that the United Nations, as a main organ that spearheaded the SDGs, will be able to address some of these development issues in as much as they are also having to dig into and be able to implement what the SDGs are. So SDG number 16, what is it? Oona has done a good job, and Crystal also telling us what this is about. I'm going to focus very quickly on the three key points: peace, justice, and strong institutions. What is peace? We all want to have peace at home. Basic peace starts from the head, the mental state of being. Largely within a community, within a country, within the global space, we also want to have peace by looking at it as the absence of conflict, the absence of war. Luckily, globally, we've seen that interstate conflict between states has reduced to some extent. And then even in regions like the continent of Africa, let me also preface that I'm going to be focusing more on issues across the continent of Africa. We have seen somehow a decline in civil conflicts than we had some years ago. So within that state of the absence of war, some progress has been done, partly because states are beginning to live up to the expectation of protecting their citizens and providing the economic basis that would hopefully prevent these conflicts from coming up, but also because of regional engagements. For example, the African Union also has been very strong in terms of putting penalties and sanctions on states that go into coup d'etats. We've had one recently in Mali, and so sanctions have been imposed on that. Apart from the African Union, at the sub-regional level, for example, in West Africa, we have the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, that has also been helping to address some of these conflict situations. So likely we are seeing some improvement in terms of the absence of conflict, but that doesn't mean that there's still conflict not happening in spaces. It's also about the well-being, the physical well-being of people. Now, if you look at the data, the statistics from the World Bank or the UN and other the statistical data, the continent of Africa scores very low when we come to indices that look at health, well-being, access to education, clean and water, reliable education, technological advancements. So there's still a lot that needs to be done in that area for governments. Justice is about the access to institutions that address people's needs within the rule of law. Largely across the continent, every country has a branch of government that is a judiciary. They have the police system that is also supposed to protect and provide justice, and other institutions. But how effectively are these institutions? Some are effective in building up on their policies of protecting citizens, but largely because of the historical burden, as Crystal mentioned in the example of the United States, the police force being used as an arm of government to suppress citizen needs. That was also how the police force largely started on the continent of Africa, being used as an instrument of the colonial forces to suppress the people. So we see that linkage between the United States experience and then the African experience. And of course, as we see, as was mentioned by Crystal and Oona, we've seen that explode in the recent protests going on in Nigeria, the EndSARS, showing the arbitrary ways in which government institutions that are supposed to protect and provide justice to people are not necessarily doing that. Beyond the police, we also have institutions like judiciaries, where people are supposed to go to have their situations or the differences solved. But largely, African judiciaries have been bogged down by multiplicity of problems, partly because of the lack of resources to pay and provide the services that are needed, pay for clerks that would efficiently work in the legal and judicial system, therefore leading to high levels of corruption and bribery. That means that dockets, files get pushed through very quickly, and justice delayed is justice denied. So we find out that that is not available to all, and especially women. Now, beyond the justice system, I want to talk about strong institutions, being mindful of time. So what are strong institutions? Institutions are defined by political scientists as rules and norms. They are not necessarily the buildings we see, but the rules and norms that help to shape thinking and actions. Institutions are strong if they are open, accessible, transparent. The rule of law is written and available for everyone to know what these rules are. These are embodied in constitutions, in laws that come from the parliaments of countries, in policies that are passed by administration, and the ways in which these rules and norms are enforced by the executive. Across the continent of Africa, largely institutions remain weak, partly because of the colonial experience of handing over institutions to African elite leaders who were not in most cases, trained well enough to handle these institutions. And then the African continent had a period what we call the Dark Ages, which I don't necessarily like that phrase. The Dark Ages, where we had 10 to 20 years of military dictatorship. So these institutions were totally destroyed. The little that we had received from the colonialists were destroyed. And so you're looking at the 1990s, where most African countries are now began to become democratic. Now, what is democracy? Largely the presence of civil, political, and other liberties. But this is taking a while to grow. And beyond the fact that we have had states transition from authoritarian regimes to democracies, we've also had instances where we call the reverse transition, where countries are going back to authoritarian forms of regime. We've seen that happen in Zimbabwe, we've had coup d'etat in Mali, we've had coup d'etats happening in other places, some conflicts also going on in Sudan. The DRC Congo is still under a lot of conflict situation. So these institutions are being destroyed, having an impact not just on generally on the populace, but affecting the question of are there judiciaries that people can run to if their rights are being abused? If the economic system is not working, what happens? Citizens therefore are liable to become migrants who are transported, either willingly or trafficked, which feeds into the whole idea of the SDGs. So these institutions are failing, but then in other places there's good governance. Ghana, for example, has been used as a country where we see some form of good governance. Senegal also has had a lot of good reports on good governance, with lack of military dictatorship. But even with these small success stories, could talk about Botswana and others, there are still issues of weak institutions, which is the culmination of the local effects of lack of good governance by leaders, but also because of the international interference in the politics of Africa. As you know, right now, there's a big standoff going on. The first woman and Black woman to head the World Trade Organization could be Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala from Nigeria. Even though the rest of the world says, yes, we're ready, the United States says no. So this is a big issue of how external factors can also affect this building of institutions, just one example. So with all these, and then of course, looking at the COVID-19 situation, some governments handled it well, others didn't, partly because of economic inabilities and also because of the lack of good governance. As we talked about, Ghana has been used as a good example of a government that has able to come in and quickly address the issue. But then also, COVID also provided authoritarian regimes an excuse to abuse their citizens. The lockdowns that they imposed, the sanctions that were imposed in Zimbabwe, protests were criminal or have been criminalized. So once again, you find in some governments, Senegal, Ghana, some extent South Africa, some would argue Botswana, where governments have been able to use law and order to address this issue, but others also has been used as a reason to impose sanctions. And of course, we can talk about Nigeria, the SARS, we can talk about the increase in gender-based violence, and then I know that we also want to talk about elections, and I don't want to be taking too much time. So I'm going to end here, and hopefully in the Q&A, we can talk about and come in if there are any questions about elections. So that's my quick intro from Algeria to Zimbabwe in 7 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much to Howard University and to the Bunche Center for inviting me. It's a great honor. I feel connected to Dr. Bunche in particular because he was both a political scientist and a diplomat, two careers that I've had, not at the same illustrious level. And in fact, he spent part of his life here in Los Angeles, where not so far from where I am right now. So there's some nice connections. I'm going to share a few slides if you don't mind. And in the process, share a little bit about my own personal, professional kind of intellectual journey through some of these issues. So here I go. Okay. I'm not so proficient with Zoom yet, but hopefully you will see this slideshow. Start. Okay. Are we okay, Crystal, with the slides? Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. So I wanted to start the journey in Libya, where I served in my former life as a diplomat for the United States, Foreign Service Officer. And I had the privilege to go to Libya shortly after the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi, who was a dictator, very authoritarian regime. And he was toppled in part through an international intervention, which we can talk about the merits of in the discussion. But in any case, I got there after Gaddafi had been toppled, and it was a place where there was great potential for justice, if for no other reason than that the UN Security Council had referred the situation in Libya to the International Criminal Court, which was incredible for many reasons. And Gaddafi was gone, and there was people who were professing to be Democrats who had taken his place. And so unlike other post-conflict places where you have remnants of a former regime, here you had this opening for both peace and justice. But the problem was that there were no institutions, because when Gaddafi fell, all the institutions fell along with him. If you know that old French phrase, l'état c'est moi, right? He was the state. And there was nothing in its wake after he was toppled. And unfortunately, the well-meaning opposition, democratic opposition that took over, wasn't able to by themselves build those institutions. And so the result was that there was no security. And so I was part of an operation, United States Embassy, but also the UN and some European embassies that were sponsoring, for instance, civil society groups, women's groups, youth groups, and so on, to help build a new order in Libya. The problem is that all of that is great, but it doesn't work so well if you don't have security. So here's a case where you find there's this difficult balance. On one hand, you don't want a security that's predatory as it was in the past, but you need some security in order for civil society to thrive. And you also need some security in order for elections to work. And now in retrospect, having the benefit of, and now my second academic career and 10 years of hindsight, I think that maybe we moved too quickly with civil society and elections, and we should have focused on institutions first, because in the end, it all fell apart, and Libya's a bit of a basket case now. We can talk about that. Another place I lived and served as a diplomat is Iraq, where there was no peace, no justice, and very weak institutions. And here there's a picture of me in a slightly younger and slimmer version of me in a refugee camp, internally displaced persons camp to be exact, in the south of Iraq. These two young boys are Sunnis who were in the south of Iraq, which is a predominantly Shia region, displaced by the Islamic State, which you all have heard about, that controlled large parts of Iraq for nearly 3 years, up to not very long ago. And part of the reason that the Islamic State was able to come to power was because of all these things: no peace, no justice, and weak institutions. They were able to come into areas of Iraq where Sunnis who felt disenfranchised after the US invasion of Iraq lived, and where they, besides the fact that they felt disenfranchised and felt marginalized, they also felt that governance was not there. And Islamic State, for all of its brutality, was actually able to institute some institutions of governance, which were sorely needed, from picking up the trash to collecting taxes to keeping the power on. And so this is, one of the effects of not having peace or justice or institutions. Another place I'd like to take you to in the broader region is Egypt, where there was no conflict per se, as in Iraq or in Libya, but there was a revolution in 2011, Tahrir Square. Some of you may remember that, and there was a brief opening for democracy, which is when I was there. Here I'm in Cairo at the Ibn Tulun Mosque, which is a beautiful, beautiful old mosque. That minaret in the back over my left shoulder is from, I think, the 10th century or something. So here there was relative peace. There wasn't any justice because there was never really truly a transition. The strongman was toppled, but there was never really any reckoning in terms of facing the past. But also importantly for this topic, I think that the authoritarian, even though there was elections, the authoritarian institutions, the military notably, but also the police, which was very brutal, and the security services were never reformed. And once, things, here's an example of a place where once things got a little bit chaotic, the military and these other authoritarian institutions were able to come back with a rhetoric of law and order and say, only it's the choices between chaos and us. And they reestablished control. And now that Egyptian revolution of 2011 seems like a long lost dream. And in fact, the country is more authoritarian than it was before under the former strongman, Hosni Mubarak. And then the final place I wanted to take you is another place that I've worked on both as an academic and as a diplomat, which is the Balkans. And here I'm referring to, of course, a bunch of countries, not just one country, but it's a region where there was conflict in the 1990s. And afterwards, the international community came in a big way. On the justice front, in fact, the UN established what is called an ad hoc tribunal, just like it did for Rwanda in the African case. In this case, it was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So there was actually quite a bit of justice, international justice, in terms of top war crime suspects being tried. And I think that was important in establishing a record of truth and so on. And there was relative peace, in part thanks to the presence of many international troops in places like Bosnia and Kosovo. But here also we have an example where institutions were there, but they were fairly weak and corrupt. So you have peace and justice, but you don't necessarily have legitimacy. And that, in my mind, is not a recipe for long-term stability. And the picture is more recent, not as a diplomat, but now as an academic with a couple of students and a colleague who teaches in Croatia in front of a building in Vukovar, which is in eastern Croatia, which was the first front lines of the 1990s Balkan Wars. And they left this train station to look like this in part as a way of memorializing the conflict. There's a lot of that in the Balkans, much less of that in the Middle East. And of course, memorializing is a path to justice as well. So just a few lessons, and I realize I'm painting and simplifying things very much and painting with very broad brush, but I think in Libya, the lesson is that you need institutions and some law and order. And of course, that can be taken too far because, as we know, authoritarian leaders and populist leaders can use that law and order to use that call for law and order for their own purposes. But I think I learned in Libya that elections cannot compensate for lack of institutions, which also you need for security. But the challenge is, again, how to build security institutions that aren't predatory, that don't, the police in the Middle East, in a lot of these authoritarian Arab countries, was distrusted, just like it is as in certain communities in this country, and that's a problem. In Iraq, I learned that justice and weak institutions open the space to extremist groups, as I've mentioned, so I'm not going to harp on that anymore. And in Egypt, strong but authoritarian institutions, military, police, security services, need to be reformed, or they'll constitute a threat to democracy, and I think you can't have justice without democracy. And then in the Balkans, peace and justice alone cannot right? We had peace and justice in the Balkans, but that doesn't take the place of strong, accountable, effective institutions or governance, which also you need for stability and legitimacy. So I guess the very unscientific conclusion is that you need each of these SDGs is a necessary but not sufficient condition for stability. End this show here. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alexandra Montgomery, the Program Director for Amnesty International Brazil. I would like to start letting you know that for me, it's an honor to be part of the BuncheTalks to discuss about peace, justice, and strong institutions. I'd like to thank the invitation of our university and with my colleagues at this conference. what I'm going to share with you is from our experience in the work that we do and the observation that we do in Amnesty International Brazil. We've been established in this country since 2012, and we have been working on police violence and police brutality mainly, of course, beyond all the other issues that we've moved in terms of human rights. So what I want to share with you is a little bit of our experience and what is going on in Brazil right now. And those are very extremely difficult times that we're living in Brazil. We've had over 159,000 cases or deaths by COVID-19 in Brazil. We're the second most affected country. We're only behind the United States. Our government officials have denied the seriousness of the pandemic and have not been following the World Health Organization's recommendations. We have observed that Black and poor people, and especially traditional populations, indigenous peoples, quilombolas, have been deeply impacted by the pandemic, and the state has not presented to this date an action plan to deal and provide adequate health and access to health and social assistance to these populations. So what we've been seeing is that human rights violations have increased severely during this pandemic, and the state violence reached its peak in Brazil in the past month. We have witnessed the increase of the abuse and the abuses by abuse of force by the policemen in the favelas, police officers in the favelas and peripheries throughout the country. Just to share with you a few data, every day 17 people are dead and are killed by the police in Brazil. In the first 6 months of this year, the Brazilian police killed 3,181 civilians. That's over 3 times the amount of people killed in the United States last year. And in this year, last year, Brazil reached the historic tragic record of 6,357 police killings in the country. When we talk about homicides rates, we see that they also have risen this year. 25,712 people were victims of murders or of homicides in the first semester. This means an increase of 7.1% of the killing, and the majority of these victims of homicides are male and Black. The political context that we are ongoing now is not favorable for the fight for human rights, right? Federal and state government officials publicly support the use of violence against favela residents. And the idea or the view that they have is that criminals criminals should die and a good criminal is a dead one. That's the framing that they have been doing, and the state institutions have been actually preventing the access to justice for these victims, and also favoring in a certain way the way that police officers act and preventing them to be charged from undoubtedly homicide. And this has been very, very difficult because it's been an increasing rhetoric that we have been dealing with. So that's to say that our institutions have been very fragile. In the past 2 years, we have also been facing attacks to spaces of social participation, such as committees and forums and groups that oversee the public policies. We have created for the past 20 years, 2 decades, we have reached a point in which we would have civil society participation in institutions and in the way that institutions can be stronger and having partially groups from civil society and partially groups from the state making the decision and driving the forces and the politics and the policies that affect to people, or they are directed to people. And those have been very much weakened in the past 2 years. And we have had major setbacks for effective engagement of civil society. There was, like, by decision from the president provided by the president last year, all over 57 councils or committees were simply closed and shut for the public participation. So state officials have been attacking the human rights discourse and views. They have been attacking LGBTQ people, indigenous peoples. They have disregarding the rights of minority groups. And the rhetoric and the authorization by their discourse have caused large setbacks in public policies. What we can say in terms of the rhetoric, racism, and state violence is very similar to what my predecessors speaking here have said. The rhetoric of law and order has shaped Brazilian public security policies. And in the past 3 decades, there was a focus on the war on drugs. That's how police forces have been using heavy military weaponry and even helicopters in their operations in favelas and poor neighborhoods. Their main target is to confront drug dealers, but not necessarily seeing them as people. They're actually socially construing, building this image of public enemies. But what it's not really taken into account in terms of designing the policies that are related to citizen security is that there are corrupt policemen that also take part in the drug dealing business and profit from the conflicts in the areas by charging bribes and participating in the weapons black market. The result of this structural and historical racism, the abusive use of force by state agents, has had a specific target. As I said before, for young and black male. 8 out of 10 people killed by the police are black, and 74% of them are less than 29 years old. So besides the accounted killings, policemen and militia groups, which are groups formed by policemen and former policemen, have been leaving unaccounted disappearances and dead bodies in different regions of the country. For example, in Rio de Janeiro, militia groups, paramilitary groups have gained power over the past 15 years and taken over 57% of Rio de Janeiro's territory, where 33.1% of the population of Rio de Janeiro reside, the favelas. These groups have been extremely violent and profit from the payment of security fees from residents and as well from any economic activity in these territories, such as cable TV, gas, water, and music. Researchers have shown that militia groups now have one drug dealing gang as their allies. And they have been battling against the biggest drug dealers gang in several regions of this. Historically, militia groups have a strong political influence in the areas where they dominate and do not lead candidates campaign on their territory unless they are allies of the militia. So if you are a candidate and you are trying to be elected, you cannot do that if you're not aligned to the militia territory. So in the past 15 years, militias have elected their own candidates for local, state, and federal houses of representatives, as well as supported candidates for the executive. There was a recent study carried out by Justiça Global and Terra de Direitos, 2 organizations, national organizations in Brazil, and they mapped 327 acts of political violence perpetrated against candidates' representatives between 2016 and 2020. There were 125 murders or attempt murders in 24 states, an average of at least 27 per year. 63% of the cases did not advance in finding the mastermind of the crime. Militia groups are well known for the use of violence against their opponents, including the political field. This context even got worse in the past 2 years with the murder of black activist and council member Marielle Franco and her driver, Anderson Gomes. After 2 years and 7 months, we still do not know who killed Marielle and why, and who gave the order. But investigations have shown that there is a probable involvement of militia groups. So when we talk about elections, peace, and justice, and when we talk about the militarization of politics, we are now in a very important moment. We are 2 weeks away from the elections in Brazil. You are 1 week away from the results in the United States, and we are 2 weeks for the election in Brazil. What we have witnessed is it's an increase and a very strong presence of police officers as candidates. Between 2010 and 2020, there were 25,452 candidates who were policemen. Most of them have an anti-human rights agenda and support this agenda publicly. We see this militarization of politics to gain more support every election. So Amnesty International is really concerned about the growth of an anti-human rights agenda in general, and especially during elections. Defending human rights should not be a matter of right or left-wing candidates. It should be a compromise of politicians, a commitment from politicians to support public policies engaged in promoting racial and social justice, respecting minorities' groups' rights, strengthening institutions, fighting racism and state violence. And this must be core in the values in politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for your really thoughtful remarks. Now I'd like to open it up to all of our attendees. Feel free to put some messages or some questions in the chat, or if you'd like to maybe speak your questions out loud, just raise your hand in the presenter section and we can call on you. I see a hand from Daryl Campbell.
Hi, good afternoon. It was a very informative piece. I am quite interested to know where have you begun, and this is for the panel, of course, where have you begun to affect these law and order rhetoric policies outside of elections?
Hi, Daryl. I just need clarification on your question. You mean where have we begun to, as panelists, or what's the world?
Yeah, to begin to make those changes of these rhetorics, because obviously they're influencing our policies that are in place. And so based off of working in international lands, how do you begin to try to affect change? Because we know here in America, they're always talking about voting and things of that nature. How do you begin to kind of make those steps, those processes to kind of let people know of the things that's happening and how some of these policies that are in play affecting what's going on in other countries?
Okay, so it sounds to me like a more generalized, not necessarily us per se as a panelist, but maybe kind of bringing some ideas into it. I'll speak very quickly on this and say that it's a multi-sectoral issue. It's at different levels, from the community level to the state level to the international level. So all these factors have to be at play somehow, and there should be some compromises and consensus, because that's what governance is all about. There should be some compromise and consensus in order to reduce conflict, because there will always be ideological divides, whether it's historically based, culturally based, or religiously based. So how do we begin to do that? I think one of the points Dr. Boduszynski mentioned, which I agree largely, that democracy has tended to be seen and to be accepted as the operative norm for good governance. But I think my colleague, if you permit me to disagree with you a bit, you said that there can be no justice without democracy. I think that it's looking at it from the liberal democratic perspective. Yes, absolutely, justice thrives and democracies are supposed to provide basic civil liberties and freedoms and political liberties, economic liberties. We've seen all that. But I think we should also be mindful of the fact that justice can exist in non-democratic spaces. Now, once again, it depends on your definition of conceptualization. I say this because when you're talking about, and based on Dr. Boduszynski's experience, wide experience, academic and diplomatic, when you look at these places you mentioned that you've been, whether Iraq and Libya, in the Balkans, and generally, that these are systems that are often considered non-Western, and they have their traditional systems of justice. And that is how we need to sometimes look, and you're talking about transitional justice systems, we need to look at the non-Western codes for democracy systems that have worked for these people and see how we can also use those justice systems to address some of these issues they face. And that also explains why some of the attempts to bring justice into these spaces have failed, because they are based on Western norms, which are largely foreign to these people. So quickly, how do we do this? And once again, I believe that democratic values are good. And even, when we say democracy without looking at it in terms of being a Western concept, democracy is everywhere. Traditional African systems, Latin American systems, native systems have their democratic principles. How do we do that? The transparency, voice. Do people have a voice? Do they have the right to be heard? How are they going to be heard? In Nigeria, we've seen that happening. In the past, under military dictatorships, you couldn't go on the streets and protest. You'll be shot dead. But now we're seeing that the citizens are out. Of course, they are being repressed brutally, but they are pushing forward. So protest is one of those. And also the issues that Ms. Montgomery raised in the case of Brazil. How are people resisting and bringing about the change that they want? There are protests that have gone on in many places in Brazil. There are ways in which women are organizing and getting their voices heard. Brazil, and I'll end up very quickly on this. I'm also very interested in learning more, because that it's a very religious state, supposedly Catholic religious, but we see that the church has not necessarily been vocal. So the question, Daryl, is how do we also involve these religious institutions? Because it's not just in Brazil, across Africa, we have a lot of these religious institutions also growing, whether Muslim or Christian, and how do we be involved? And those are all falling into civil society. So it's a long roundabout in saying that it has to happen at multiple levels, and lastly, the international influence has to be open and transparent, because we often are told that the Western forces are coming in to save these places, but no, they're coming in and bringing more trouble to these spaces. So we also need to hold these international institutions accountable for their interventions in these countries that are also trying to be democratic, trying to build strong institutions. The help is not always a good one.
Could I just respond briefly, Dr. Dawuni? Thank you for that. I completely agree with you that in places like Libya and Iraq, for instance, that need for kind of grassroots traditional forms of reconciliation and justice, for instance, tribal mechanisms and so on, is extremely important, if for no other reason than because there is not a strong central state that can in any time soon institute a system of justice or reconciliation. So I didn't want to define justice too narrowly. Having said that, I do think that for the high level, state-sponsored violence and crimes, because we're talking about some countries where those institutions don't exist, I do think, even though the ICC has all kinds of problems and other international courts have all kinds of problems, they do play a role in providing accountability and at least truth-telling in a way that those local mechanisms couldn't. And I think that while you're right that we can't, think of this in a very Western-centric way, I also think that some authoritarian governments in the region, there's a danger of also using that rhetoric to refuse cooperation with the ICC, right? Saying that it's imperialist or saying that it's, not in our tradition. And that also, leaves a lot of people with blood on their hands unaccountable.
Okay, it looks like Curtis Reynolds, do you have a question? You're on mute right now, but I'll go ahead and unmute you. or actually, if you could press the mute button, you should be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
No, I didn't have any questions at this time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Magai, it looks like you have a question.
Hi, my name is Maggie. Well, hi everyone. I want to say once again, like, thank you to everyone on the panel. It's been really interesting to hear some of your thoughts and inputs on these different regions. My question was kind of bringing us back to, I guess, where the rule even started, or this goal. What role do you feel an institution or like an IGO like the United Nations has in helping a lot of these countries in accomplishing this SDG goal? Because I think as one thing that everyone has touched on is that there seems to be a lot of corruption within these governments. And then especially specifically with Brazil, obviously we see it in these other regions, we see that there's actually a lot of government sanctioned violence against people. So on one hand, we can say like, we want it to be community based, and that's very important in terms of grassroots, encouraging people to be involved with their government. But when a lot of times the response from the government is something like direct violence that leaves a lot of people dead, what does that really look like in terms of international interference or interjection in these in situations where we see clear violations of human rights? Because the United Nations did put forth this SDG goal for a lot of these regions to achieve, but at the same time, I would argue personally, in my opinion, I think that a lot of times the United Nations serves more as a symbolic like figurehead, and they set forth a lot of goals, for countries to achieve, but then countries like, if the United States decides to no longer participate or no longer cooperate, you see a lot of institutions or IGOs like the United Nations now no longer have teeth. Now they're just speaking, they're putting forth goals that we want to achieve by 2030, but then actually just leaving it to governments. So my question to the panelists is, what does that really look like? Not necessarily just from the United Nations perspective, but how, or what solutions do you suggest that are put forth that don't leave it entirely to the governments and their communities to try to figure out these issues, because we already know that a lot of these governments are corrupt? Thank you.
I might can tap into, I know the experts probably have more of an expertise, but as a UN advocate and a person that does find this conversation really intriguing, I'll kind of take my little 2 cents and put it forth. And so I think it was really interesting how you mentioned, let's say if the US pulled out, like, you know, as they did with WHO, that the UN loses its teeth. But I think that speaks to, one, we need to really advocate for full support and full funding, because I think as a developed nation, as a first world country, as we call it, that it's kind of hard to really view the work of the UN unless you're following it closely. They tend to do a lot of development work, specifically in countries that don't meet the standards for a developed nation. And I think that we need to, I know for me as an American, it's easy to turn a blind eye to a lot of the issues a lot of these developing countries are facing. And so we say things like, oh, I'm not sure what the UN does. They serve symbolically, but I think for me, if I'm really looking and doing research and trying to understand the types of work that they do, you know that they are specifically focused on development, or was it giving food or saving people, refugees, making sure that if political violence is happening in a certain part of the world, we are helping them flee the country, serving its protection, etc. And I think the conversation before about, you know, Western ideals of political governments versus more native political government is really interesting, because I do think that overall, from my perspective, I see that the UN takes, I guess, a westernized approach to political governments. And Dr. Dawuni, your point was magnificent, because, you know, we were learning this in class, how a lot of times this westernized government is very foreign to a lot of these nations. And I will say the UN is not a perfect institution, but I would like to see, which I think will be interesting, focus on kind of the redevelopment in local political organized structures. I can see now in Africa the reemergence of the chieftaincy structure, which is original to Africa versus the democracies and monarchies, essentially European nations instilling their specific political governance structure on their specific colonies when they were colonizing Africa. And I think that overall we need to, when in terms of the UN, we need to, of course, advocate for full funding, but really take notice of the work that they're doing and kind of seeing the specific, not just goals, but specific initiatives they are doing in specific countries. If you look at the UN website, and there's a lot of UN bodies, not just the one in New York, and they're based all over the world, that they have specific missions for specific countries, for specific issues. And overall, they do lead, they all tend to the issues that political instability can cause. And yeah, I think that it's, you know, it's a bigger issue, a bigger problem at hand. And I think your question is really interesting because, like I said before, it kind of ties into the westernized political structures that we're trying to, I guess, instill on a lot of the world that's not native to them. And so I think from the UN, like, and I'm an advocate, but I also like to see what they're working on. And I think criticism is not a bad thing as well. See their stance on political formal, I wouldn't call it consulting, but I know that, I guess, trying to help countries build those democracy systems. You have experts coming in and trying to facilitate, let's say, safe elections, secure elections. Turnover could be a huge problem for countries, turning over governments from one leadership power to another. And so they do work on stuff like that. But also I would like to see or hear more about the native structures to different lands, because that's something I don't know entirely about. Let's say for Brazil, I'm not sure, before they were colonized by the Portuguese, I'm not sure what their native structure was, etc. So that's something I also want to learn more about, but I'd love to hear from the experts as well.
If I can offer a comment on this question, I think, well, the role that international organizations can play and how not leaving that specifically to states alone to deal with it. I think I agree with what Dr. Dawuni, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I'm not a native speaker, so I hope you understand if I misspelled it. I think I agree with her that the approach on how do we begin and how do we engage other stakeholders and how do we start to deal with both the law and policy narrative and approach, and also on how this oversight of institutions could be accomplished. And because I think these two questions can be complementary. The way I see that is that there are at least a few levels in which change has to be addressed, or issues that have to be addressed in order for us to achieve change and in order for us to deal with governments and the government strengthening of public institutions or of institutions in general. As Dr. mentioned before, the institutions are basically by definition the rules and the norms, right? So if we're talking about that, it not necessarily matter what kind of a political regime they are in, but it is relevant how effective they are in terms of allowing for the participation. And we know that political systems have different approaches and have different interrelationships with civil society and with the people. So it's kind of especially for the Western countries, to see through our lens, and that's the natural way of doing that. Democracy would be one of the ideal models. But I agree with Dr. D that we probably could leave space for another possible approaches, especially because in the UN allows for that, especially when you have in the UN Charter the assurance of the right to self-determination of the specific peoples. And I think this is a very difficult territory to navigate, because the definition of self-determination and how that is applied nowadays, it's very tricky. But what I would say is that if we have a broad understanding on how those people in the countries where they're facing violence and where they're facing retrocess or regression of rights, and where they're facing governments that have allowed human rights violations to be carried out. We need to put them in the center, and we need to, and I think there are several stakeholders that can play a role there. If we are talking about, if you approach that by the community level, but also by the organizational level, let's say for civil society and non-governmental organizations, the role that they can play, and I would include, not blindly, but I would include the religion institutions here, as Dr. D has mentioned. What is the work that we need to do on the ground with the people in the communities for the understanding of these issues and the problems they are facing? So how do we connect with people in the communities that have been the police invading their houses every day and saying that killing them is the best thing they do, because they don't see those people in those communities as equals, and they are something that has to be combated and confronted. And this is a state view, is the way that the state creates this narrative and this policy that allows Black people to die, basically. That's what we're talking about here in Brazil, is that when I say that 8 out of 10 people killed by the police are Black and are male and are under 29, what I'm saying is basically there is an indiscriminate and intentional policy to drop dead bodies. And that's that discussion here in Brazil, because of the so-called racial democracy myth, is very difficult to break and in fact analyze, structure, and discuss. And so what is the role of the UN on that, right? How can the UN strengthen those people in those communities? I shared with you, like, the international organizations, the civil society organizations can strengthen, even some religious groups in a certain way, and it's been more shady than ever here in Brazil, because the state has been very linked, and this very conservative view has really impaired the possibility of people to move their agendas and have an indiscriminate impact in minorities groups and people from different religions or people from different approaches. But what I think is strengthening these initiatives, this community-based participation from the local association of residents in the favelas to the more formal spaces in politics. We have to have possibility to input, to talk to these people, and to have these people exchanging information with us and learning from them, and instead of teaching them on what they should do in terms of, oh, this is what democracy means, this is what I expect you to vote for this council person, because that's how we change the world. No, that there are movements in these places that create structure and creates change and creates movement and empowers people. So how do we start thinking about this in a moment where people have been completely oppressed? The role of the international institutions, and I would include the regional system, can be strengthening. The role of the institutions, the country institutions can be strengthened by regional international institutions too. Dr. D shared with us in the beginning how the Organization of African States has supported or has helped in shaping a new way of cooperation among African states. And that's very similar in the Latin American region. The Organization of American States has political bodies in which we can move a lot in terms of elections, in terms of governance, in terms of actions. But it also had, both systems have in common judicial and a quasi-judicial system to try human rights violations. So here we're talking about two things. We're talking about how society needs to improve and how we have to address with human rights violations. One thing is a goal. One thing is how the UN sets standards and the countries commit to these standards to progress and to advance. The other thing is the daily human rights violations that these people are facing, and they're not facing, and the perpetrators are not facing justice. So how these two components in this United Nations that is so broad and that has so many governing bodies and so many offices is hard to understand, and it's hard to piece each other together, but it's essential, and especially if we count on the regional systems to ensure accountability for human rights violations. So solidarity from other nations is fundamental in the political bodies, but ensuring that the states fulfill their obligations that they signed for in these international forums is also essential. I will stop here.
Thank you for that response, and thank you all for your questions. In the interest of time, we're going to close here. But again, I just want to say thank you to our great panelists. You all gave us a lot to think about, a lot to research, I think, once we close out too. And thank you all for attending as well. So on that note, I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.